opening the center immediately, aiming for rapid piece development and active king attack. Carving out a central pawn structure with this initial step promises solid positional foundations for the queenside. Developing the knight so early solidifies the center and prepares for a rapid queenside buildup. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's space and open lines for active piece play. Developing the knight here targets the central pawn and prepares for castling, asserting influence over d4 and e5. Liberating the pawn's central influence opens dynamic possibilities and challenges white's immediate control. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight repositions your piece centrally, immediately contesting the d5 square and creating potential forks. Developing the knight to d7 clears the way for the queen and supports a potential pawn push to e5, solidifying the center and preparing for a more active middle game. Developing the bishop aggressively to the diagonal creates immediate pressure on black's queenside and signals intent for an active middle game. Developing the knight to a central square reinforces control and prepares for pawn liberation. Instilling a sense of immediate danger on the kingside, this knight boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around black's king and disrupting any comfortable development plans. Emboldening the kingside pawn structure now allows for potential pawn breaks, but it also creates a central weakness that the knight at g5 can exploit. Consider how this prepares for a potential h6 idea to dislodge the annoying knight. White immediately seizes the open e-file, preparing to pressure black's castled king while subtly centralizing the queen, a valuable piece often best placed on active diagonals or open files. A bold rerouting of the knight, aiming to solidify central presence and potentially escape the knight's current awkward outpost, though it relinquishes the pawn on e6 and opens new tactical avenues for white's queen. Pushing the d-pawn forward now seizes central space, reinforcing the knight on e4 and aiming to control more of the board's heart. This strategically sound pawn advance prepares for further piece development and aims to restrict black's options. Unleashing a pawn thrust like that, black forces a confrontation, potentially creating pawn weaknesses around his king if the knight retreats to a less protected square. This aggressive pawn push aims to disrupt white's knight on g5, but it also demands careful calculation to avoid falling into tactical traps. A bold repositioning, the knight sacrifices tempo to find a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's kingside pawn structure. This maneuver aims to disrupt black's development and create tactical opportunities by unbalancing the position. Developing the bishop to a more active square, the knight on g5 is now under pressure, and black prepares to castle kingside while solidifying the center. Solidifying the king's safety through castling is a sensible defensive maneuver, especially given the pawn structure and the potential for central piece activity. By tucking the monarch away, white gains a more secure base for future operations and frees up the rook to join the action. This also prepares for pawn advances on the kingside if opportunities arise. Activating the queen and preparing to contest the center, this move also eyes potential pawn breaks on the queenside, subtly preparing for future pawn advances. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal anticipates the pawn push to b5, securing the light squares and offering improved defensive potential against black's developing queenside pieces. Castling secures the king, finally tucking it away behind the pawn shield and activating the rook for potential central influence, a sensible defensive maneuver after black's pieces have developed with remarkable compactness. Unleashing a powerful pawn thrust, white immediately seeks to destabilize black's central structure and gain valuable territory. This aggressive pawn push aims to dislodge the knight on d5 and potentially open lines towards the enemy king. The spatial squeeze on black's queenside intensifies, forcing a decision on how to react to this bold advance. Retreating the knight to f6 reinforces the center and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece development, but it surrenders the initiative and allows white to solidify their central presence, creating a more cramped position for black's pieces and restricting their maneuverability. Shifting the bishop to this square isn't about immediate confrontation. It's a subtle repositioning, preparing to exert influence over the kingside diagonals while potentially clearing the path for a queenside expansion. The knight on e4 is now less vulnerable to direct attacks, and the bishop's presence on c2 can support a future b4 pawn push, aiming to undermine black's central control. This move prioritizes strategic maneuvering over flashy tactics, aiming to build a long-term positional advantage. Opening the d-file for the rook, black signals an intent to contest central control and potentially activate the piece along this open pathway, aiming for a more dynamic game. Reasserting control of the d5 square and preparing to challenge black's central influence with a potential c5 push, white strategically redeploys the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's harmony and prepare for future pawn advances. Stepping onto d6 solidifies the bishop's role, offering mutual support with the knight while preparing to potentially contest the d-file. The rook's activation along the e-file signals a potent centralizing impulse, aiming to support the knight's advanced post and potentially prepare a pawn thrust or further piece development towards black's castled position. Shifting the bishop to f4 might appear active, but it exposes it to potential harassment and allows white to solidify their pawn structure by potentially playing g3, creating a safer square for the knight. This bishop repositioning doesn't immediately address black's lack of central control or create new attacking opportunities. Instead, it offers white a chance to improve their piece coordination and potentially gain a tempo later on. The knight leaps forward, initiating a duel for central influence and challenging black's somewhat passive placement of its pieces. This aggressive advance aims to disrupt the harmony of black's setup, potentially creating weaknesses around the king or on the d6 bishop square. It's a dynamic pivot, seeking to exploit the slight overextension of black's pawn chain while simultaneously preparing for further tactical operations. The knight's new home is a provocative outpost, demanding an immediate response from black and injecting a significant dose of complexity into the middle game. A sudden liquidation of the bishop pair for black, sacrificing the advantage of two bishops for what seems like a purely material exchange after white's knight retreat. This decision immediately alters the game's character, potentially opening lines for white's queen and rooks while simplifying black's position, perhaps with the hope of later exploiting an exposed white king. The move also grants white significant central influence and temporarily removes a key defender of the black kingside, making one wonder about black's long-term plan and whether the resulting pawn structure will truly be a solid foundation. Unifying the rook signals a commitment to mastering the central files, preparing to exert pressure along the d-file and potentially the c-file as well, aiming to pry open lines towards black's king. Unshackling the knight from its pinned status on f8 aims to reintegrate it into the central struggle, potentially supporting a pawn advance or preparing to contest open files. Although its placement there temporarily concedes central space and leaves the kingside a bit more vulnerable to white's bishop and rook battery. Reclaiming the open d-file after black's bishop sacrifice is a logical step, preparing for potential central advances and solidifying piece coordination while the opponent's knights are somewhat passive. Activating the bishop to d7 prepares for eventual c5, a common pawn break in these structures, aiming to challenge white's central grip and free the d8 rook. Unlocking that queenside potential, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize territorial advantage, forcing a reassessment of black's defensive setup. Black's knight finally finds a natural resting spot on d5, aiming to disrupt white's queenside expansion and perhaps prepare for a central pawn push or even a maneuver towards the kingside. This move is a response to white's aggressive c5 pawn push, which has created some dynamic imbalances. By placing the knight here, black challenges white's central control and opens up potential lines of attack. It's a crucial moment for black to consolidate and find counterplay, as white has a slight space advantage and a more harmonious piece development. The knight's presence on d5 can also help to deter white's potential pawn breaks. Re-establishing knight dominance on e4 after the recent exchange, this maneuver aims to pin down the black knight on f6 and exert pressure on the queenside. The knight's relocation from g5 to e4 signifies a strategic pivot, shifting the focus of white's attacking potential. Instead of directly confronting the weakened dark squares, this knight now prepares to join the central fight, potentially supporting a c5 pawn push or reinforcing the d4 outpost. Black must be acutely aware of the potential for tactical sequences that arise from this repositioning, especially concerning the coordination of white's pieces on the queenside and center. The current position is ripe for subtle maneuvering, and white's move signals an intention to outmaneuver black's more passive setup. Bringing the bishop back to e8 seems like a defensive repositioning, but it creates a somewhat passive structure, ceding more central control to white and potentially hindering piece development, especially if white continues to advance on the queenside. This knight's arrival on d6 creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions or exposing weaknesses. Disrupting the pawn chain creates immediate complications, aiming to unbalance the position by challenging white's advanced knight and potentially opening lines for your pieces. A calculated gamble, qf3 throws down the gauntlet, challenging black's seemingly solid structure by eyeing the f7 square, a classic target in many openings. This move injects a dose of dynamism into the game, potentially forcing a defensive reaction from black that might create weaknesses. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative, creating immediate threats and forcing black to reconsider their comfortable development. The queen's redeployment signals a shift in white's intentions, moving from subtle positional maneuvering to a more direct offensive approach. Consider how this queen's new placement impacts the overall piece coordination for both sides. Reclaiming the open c-file, black reinforces their queenside presence, preparing to contest central control and potentially develop pressure along the ranks. Strategically repositioning the knight to a more active square, this maneuver aims to control key central squares and potentially launch an attack on black's queenside pawns by creating threats along the now open c-file. Unleashing a cascade of pawns, black initiates a structural fragmentation, deliberately fracturing their own pawn chain in the center to open critical lines. A bold gambit to disrupt white's imposing central control and awaken dormant pieces for counterplay. Unlocking the c-file for your rooks now creates immense pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, potentially forcing defensive concessions and a weakening of their king's shield. Repositioning the knight from the busy f8 square aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential central advances, though it allows white's knight a temporary outpost on d6. The queen's redeployment to e4 subtly prepares for a potential kingside assault, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black monarch after the recent pawn exchanges. Reclaiming the knight's outpost, black reestablishes a crucial defensive presence on f6, aiming to shield the kingside from white's aggressive pawn push and potential queen incursions, while simultaneously preparing to contest the weakened d-file. White repositions the queen to the d4 square, consolidating control over the c5 pawn and preparing for potential breakthroughs, while also offering a safe haven for the queen should black's queenside pressure become overwhelming. Steering the knight back to d7 looks like a strategic retreat, re-establishing a defensive outpost and preparing to redeploy, perhaps to f6 if the pressure on the kingside eases. Gaining a foothold on the queenside with the pawn push, white seeks to liberate that beleaguered rook from its cramped position and potentially initiate a breakthrough. Black's knight retreats, a seemingly passive redeployment, but strategically it begins to unwind the cramped position on the kingside, preparing to offer more dynamic possibilities by potentially eyeing central squares or supporting a future kingside pawn advance, while white's queenside pressure from the advanced pawn might soon become a concern. Unlocking the queenside pawns, this advance aims to break the blockade and potentially create a passed pawn, though it does leave the pawn chain somewhat less defended. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside with that pawn push promises to unravel white's compact structure, aiming to seize the initiative by opening lines for black's pieces, potentially targeting the exposed white king. The queen's repositioning to g4 aims to both pressure the kingside and free up the d4 square for potential pawn advances, creating a more dynamic attacking posture. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, F5 shatters the seemingly solid central pawn structure, aiming to break open lines against white's castled monarch and create counterplay for black's cramped position, though it does invite potential weaknesses. A surprising repositioning of the queen, potentially aiming to exploit weaknesses on the king side or simply to escape the current pressure and prepare for a more active role, although it leaves the central pawns somewhat exposed and requires careful attention to black's potential counterplay. The knight's journey to d5 is a fascinating dance around the pawn storm, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed queenside and potentially launch a counterattack. This repositioning could be a bid to activate the knight from its currently somewhat passive placement, eyeing opportunities on the king side, or even supporting a central pawn push if the situation allows. It's a proactive maneuver, seeking to break the static nature of the position and create dynamic possibilities. Unleashing the knight to the edge board feels like a bold, territorial claim, aiming to disrupt black's precarious pawn structure and potentially force concessions on the queen side. The bishop's retreat to the h5 square ignites a fascinating strategic battle, attempting to reposition this piece to a more active diagonal and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. It's a bold attempt to untangle black's pieces and find attacking potential, especially considering white's queenside pawn expansion. This move signals a shift in focus, perhaps looking for ways to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from white's committed pawn push on the queen side, while also keeping a watchful eye on the king side. Repositioning the rook to the central file intends to increase pressure along the c-file, potentially unbalancing black's position, especially if the defender's king remains exposed. Unleashing a storm on the queen side, this pawn thrust dramatically alters the pawn structure and seeks to disrupt white's coordinated pieces by creating immediate dynamism. Unlocking the queen's potential along this diagonal, white aims to exploit the lingering weaknesses around black's king. This repositioning signals an intention to potentially disrupt black's queenside pawn structure, or even initiate a direct assault. Consider the immediate threats and black's defensive capabilities in response to this aggressive queen maneuver. The interplay of forces on the queen side has reached a critical juncture, and this queen redeployment injects new strategic possibilities. By bringing the queen into the fray, white seeks to create tactical complications and put pressure on black's vulnerable pieces. Suddenly, the bishop vacates its post, creating a potential escape square for the king, but also inviting a forceful advance by white's queen. Suddenly, the bishop shifts to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially eye the vulnerable king. Sacrificing the exchange here, black plunges into sharp tactical waters, aiming to dismantle white's formidable pawn chain and expose the king through relentless piece activity. This audacious gambit seeks to disrupt white's harmonious development by trading a rook for a knight, prioritizing immediate counterplay over material balance. The hope is that the ensuing open lines and weakened kingside will grant black sufficient compensation for the sacrificed exchange, potentially leading to a mating attack or a winning material imbalance if white missteps. Liberating the c-file for the rook, this captures a defender and opens avenues towards the black king's position. The queen's re-entry into the fray, though visually active, now finds itself oddly exposed on d6, a target ripe for white's impending battery on the c-file. Unlocking the potent b-file for your rook, this capture clears a critical path while simultaneously relieving the pin on your knight, setting up active counterplay. Reclaiming the f-pawn initiates a desperate attempt to activate the beleaguered knight, but this still leaves the black king precariously exposed with no easy avenues for defense. Sacrificing the bishop opens a crucial diagonal for your queen, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and expose their king. Reclaiming the rook on e8 stabilizes black's defenses, consolidating the now fractured position after white's aggressive pawn sacrifice and material gain, while simultaneously preparing for potential counterplay on the open e-file that white has inadvertently created. Unleashing the knight to a central outpost, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's precarious pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the king side, while simultaneously bolstering white's own piece coordination. attempting to reignite the queenside attack by bringing the monarch to a more active square. But this overlooks white's impending control of the central files and the potential for a decisive breakthrough towards the black king. Reclaiming the pawn on f4 sharpens the attack against black's exposed king, aiming to exploit the weakened diagonal that was opened by the exchange on e8. Unleashing the knight to g6 signals a desperate attempt to reignite activity on the kingside, hoping to disrupt white's imposing piece battery and potentially create some counterplay, although it leaves the dark squares around black's king somewhat exposed. Opening a new avenue of attack on the queenside, white aims to exploit black's slightly exposed king. Securing the monarch from the immediate threats, this placement aims to find a safer haven, although it leaves the g-file a potential target for future advances, hinting at a shift towards prophylaxis as the material balance thins. Probing the knight's influence, white repositions the cavalry for a coordinated assault, aiming to exploit the exposed king and cramped black position after the recent pawn sacrifices.